We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. We have two Americas. In the last week and behind the scenes, the Pentagon is working with Israel to carry out the plan for the invasion of Rafah. And at the same time, colleges and universities have erupted in mass protests, and they are spreading throughout the United States. These are protests in support of the Palestinian people. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Layan Fuleihan. She is a Palestinian organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition. She is also a popular educator, organizer, and the education director at the People's Forum. She is also an editor at 1804 Books. Layan, welcome back to the Socialist Program.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Thank you. Layan, you have been at Columbia University. You have been in the streets. People in the thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people all over the country, including here in New York at Columbia. There are other campuses too. NYU, mass arrests at NYU. There were mass arrests at Columbia. The university threatened last night told the student negotiators, we're going to bring in the National Guard against you, against their own students. And this is 54 years after the massacre by the National Guard of students at Kent State who were protesting the war in Vietnam. Anyway, the threats of repression, the arrests, the brutality, it's not stopping the protests. They are growing. Let's start with that, because this is something new, or at least a return of something that used to be a dynamic factor in American politics: young people and students on the move.
Absolutely. What we've seen in the past week on the campuses that started at Columbia University here in New York, but that has spread like wildfire across the country, is really incredible. It's a new wave of uprising from the students, from the youth, and from everyone who's been activated through this mass mobilization for Palestine over the past 6 months. And we've seen that anytime these universities have clamped down, and we've seen very similar repressive tactics from all these different university administrations, especially the elitist universities, all of their attempts to repress or intimidate the protests has actually backfired and has given strength not only to the students, but to their supporters that are in the streets, who have been carrying out the mass movement for Palestine and who are now making sure that what happens on the campus is not isolated from the rest of the world. It's really incredible to see. I think it's a sign of the times that we're in. It's a sign of the fact that the Biden administration's attempts to repress or move on from the mass outrage over the genocide in Palestine have completely failed. And in fact, he has a much bigger problem on his hands than he might have thought previously.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the past months, the Palestinian Hamas-led, but it wasn't only Hamas-led military incursion into Israel, into areas that were formerly Palestinian villages from which Palestinian people were driven. The area right outside the wall that the Israelis have established to keep people in Gaza. Ever since then, and now it's more than a half a year, people in the United States have been in the streets in record numbers, the largest ever. On November 4th, we had 500,000 people in Washington, D.C. January 13th, a demonstration of similar size. But besides the big national protests, there are things happening every day. And all of these young people have been learning a lot. I mean, in struggle, coping with the problem of demonization, being ridiculed and caricatured as anti-Semites, being the victims of police repression, being, in the case of Columbia, suspended from school, kicked out of their dorms. They've learned a lot. And as a consequence, we have a new generation of progressive young activists and organizers. And, you know, you've been there with them These people are emerging as real leaders, and I don't think this is going to stop.
I don't think so either. And I think what's really interesting and incredible about this particular moment, and I think has happened in different moments in history in the past as well, is that when these students speak out and when they take action like this, and then they come against the instruments of state repression, it suddenly makes it very real what they are actually up against. I mean, the students at Columbia University are demanding divestment. They're demanding something very reasonable, something that doesn't necessarily need an NYPD response. But what is being demonstrated is, in fact, going against the very close and important relationship of the United States and Israel, and putting pressure on the institutions that make that relationship possible, is actually triggering a response of state violence. Last night, the president of Columbia University threatened student negotiators with bringing in the National Guard to clear out their peaceful encampment. And the students very correctly and very courageously knew that this meant the end of good faith negotiations. And they made the very correct move to blast this to the media and to put the university on notice. What we're seeing is, in real time, these students are not just expressing a political position. They're not just saying, we're bothered by the genocide. We don't want our alma mater to have these connections to the genocide. They're saying, we understand the way these institutions, whether or not they're academic or financial or whatever they are, these institutions are actually serving the interests and facilitating the possibility for the United States to continue executing the genocide of the Palestinian people. And they're saying, we are ready to do what we need to do to make that stop, and to put as much pressure as possible on the institution itself, to put it in a position where it's going to have to acquiesce to some version of their demands. So I think it's a really incredible moment, and I think it also shows how much of a threat this change in consciousness is to the White House, to the imperialist agenda, and to everybody who is profiting right now off of the massacre of the Palestinian people.
Indeed. I think the students last night at Columbia, and you, Layan, you're the education director at the People's Forum. People's Forum, the Answer Coalition, others were Palestinian Youth Movement, the Students for Justice in Palestine, large parts of the progressive movement that's been leading these demonstrations around the country for the past, more than a half a year now. Everybody sprang into action last night. The president, or the negotiators for the president at Columbia, said, if you don't surrender, if you don't end your encampment, we're going to call in the National Guard. Now this, for our audience that's outside the United States, who may not know or maybe are too young to remember what happened at Kent State, and we have some footage from Kent State, this has a very particular meaning in the United States, because when the National Guard was called to suppress demonstrations on college campuses, it led to violence. It led to suppression. It led to actually the U.S. military forces deployed on college campuses shooting and killing students. So this was designed for maximum intimidation. And the students and the People's Forum and Answer Coalition and the Palestinian Youth Movement and others went into action, exposed it, and then within a couple hours, huge masses of people arrived at Columbia University at like 11 o'clock at night last night, and then stayed for hours. And then the university changed its tune. Anyway, before I get your response, I want to play this clip for people who may not know about the Kent State Massacre, because this is the emotive context for what it means to call the National Guard to U.S. campuses.
NBC News senior correspondent Tom Brokaw takes a look back at when National Guard troops opened fire on protesting students 50 years ago today.
Kent State University, May 4th, 1970. The tragedy that day, like so much back then, was rooted in the war in Vietnam. The trouble started 4 days earlier with President Nixon's announcement that he was widening the war into Cambodia.
American units searching for North Vietnamese troops and installations. But what they will find or how long they will be here, no one can say for sure.
All right, and we have a second part of that clip, which I also want to play for people to see what actually happened at Kent State.
At Kent State, the campus was in turmoil after days of protest. The National Guard was sent in. The students ordered to disperse. They refused. Some threw rocks. The Guard used tear gas. Then, without warning, using live ammunition, they opened fire. At least a dozen students were hit. 4 were killed.
That's the emotive context, Layan, for bringing the National Guard to U.S. college campuses. This was seared into the memory of everybody from that generation. 2 weeks after that, police agencies carried out the massacre at Jackson State, a black university in Mississippi, a similar massacre of students. So when you have the president of Columbia University, who's called before Congress just in the last week, who's being ridiculed by Congress, being demanded by the right wing in Congress, take action, take action. She tells the students who a few days earlier she had mass arrested, okay, now if you don't capitulate, we're bringing the National Guard. And the students actually did not fold. Really an amazing testament to their strength.
Completely agree with you. It is really an amazing expression of their strength, of their clarity, and the fact of the level of commitment they have to the struggle that is unfolding before us right now and that has been building over the past months. I think that the willingness of the university president to threaten military violence on her own students is, one, a sign of her weakness and her misjudgment, of course, and the interests of the university. But I think also it's part of this general program that's coming from the White House to demonize pro-Palestinian protesters. Biden has made comments about the student movement. He said he has a program to deal with it. There's been kind of like a coordinated attempt to paint the students as anti-Semitic, as people who are creating unsafe conditions on campuses. There's been a lot of attempts to demonize the student protesters, and that hasn't worked either. I think it seems that every single time there is an attempt from different levels of government, whether it's from the university administrations or the police forces, or messages from Eric Adams, for example, the mayor of New York City, or from Biden himself, it's galvanizing the students more because it's really clarifying exactly who they are up against and why. And it makes this an issue that goes beyond Palestine. The students are here demanding specific demands around divestment from financial ties with the Israeli state and the Israeli military. But if you go beyond that, once you start protesting against something like this, something like financial ties, and then the police is unleashed on you and military force is threatened on you, then you realize that it's actually the entire system that is culpable here. And it gives a whole nother level to the stakes at hand. And it's really amazing to see the students realizing this in real time, organizing around it, and developing more collective strength as the days and the hours go by. Actually, things are changing by the hour, and the students have been responding in a very strategic and unified manner.
You mentioned earlier, Layan, that the Israelis have not succeeded militarily in their campaign in Gaza. I mean, if you compare it to the 1982 Israeli invasion into Lebanon, and the bombing of Beirut that was directed against the PLO, they drove the PLO out of Beirut. The PLO had to leave the country. That was a huge blow to the Palestinian movement. Here we are more than a half year later, not in Lebanon, not somewhere else, but in Gaza, like right there. And the Israelis have not succeeded in their military objective, which is to dismantle and crush Hamas. Hamas fighters are still fighting. It's not only Hamas. The resistance forces are still fighting. Yes, they've killed 35,000 people. 100,000 have been either wounded or killed. That's like 5% of the population of a 2.1 million people who live in Gaza. So a lot of death and destruction, but they haven't achieved their military objectives. And now Netanyahu is making the argument that in order to save his own skin, and perhaps the Biden administration agreeing with him because the pariah state status of Israel is now shared by the United States and the Biden administration, they now believe the outcome will be the invasion of Rafah, the southern part of Gaza where more than 1 million Palestinians have huddled as refugees from their other homes that have already been destroyed in Gaza. So Biden has been pretending as if he's opposed to the Rafah invasion. He's like, oh no, we have to have a clear plan for how Palestinian civilians are going to be protected if indeed you go into Rafah. So some people are reading that and saying, see, Biden is really against the invasion of Rafah. But that's not what it is. They are actually planning for the invasion of Rafah. And by they, I'm talking about the U.S. government, which Joe Biden is the commander-in-chief. I want to read to you, Layan, from the New York Times. It's just the last couple days. U.S. military officials say that Israel should model its plan on, meaning plan for the invasion of Rafah, on the siege of Mosul, Iraq in 2017 by Iraqi forces and the U.S. Air Force. The operation destroyed large swaths of what was once Iraq's second largest city. And then it says, while roughly 3,000 civilians were killed, it was basically pretty much an operation that saved civilians. Now, I have a clip here from, this is a U.S. general, because Mosul was destroyed. Second largest city in Iraq. Huge city, very multi-ethnic, it was Christian, Muslim, a Jewish community. There was people, there were Kurds, a very diverse part of Iraq, and the second largest city north of Baghdad. And in 2017, the U.S. destroyed it. Now, I want to play this clip. It's from a U.S. general who says, no, we didn't, we protected civilians. And then I want to play another clip after that, which is what the damage in Mosul actually looked like, and reminding people, this is what the Biden administration is telling Netanyahu should be the model for the invasion of Rafah. Let's start with the first clip. It's the general talking about how the invasion, the destruction of Mosul was great.
I reject any notion that coalition fires were in any way imprecise, unlawful, or excessively targeted civilians. I would challenge the people from Amnesty International or anyone else out there who makes these charges to first research their facts and make sure they're speaking from a position of authority. I would argue that this is, I believe, the most precise campaign in the history of warfare.
All right, Layan, I want to show you a drone coverage of what he calls the most precise campaign in the history of warfare. Here's Mosul, everybody. Take a look. Take a look very carefully. There's some before and after pictures. Mosul is gone. Mosul is a huge, beautiful city in the northern part of Iraq, and it was destroyed. And this, Layan, is what the Biden administration is actually preparing for Rafah. Just look at that destruction. And again, I've been to Mosul. It was a beautiful place. It was destroyed.
There's a lot to be said about this this advice that the Pentagon is giving the Israelis at this moment. And I think there's a couple of things that are important to draw out here. I think this is really important. It's not the first time, actually, in the past period, the past 6 months, that different voices from the United States have made the comparison between Mosul and Gaza, they've mostly done it along the lines of the fact that it's a small, highly concentrated, highly densely populated urban area where there's asymmetrical warfare being taken place. And so I've seen different military think tanks already make this connection. But the fact that the Pentagon is that quote that you read from the New York Times, that the Pentagon is actively advising Israel to model its Rafah operation on the operation in Mosul is absolutely ridiculous for many reasons. One, like you said, Biden is pretending to have some concern for civilians. And if we know what actually happened in Mosul, that destruction that you showed us is absolutely devastating. The numbers of casualties are at least 3 times higher than what the United States reported. They reported Mosul as an example of one of the most successful evacuations. But if you actually look at what the evacuation looked like, it was putting people into very small areas and were bombed. I mean, when Biden says we need to evacuate over 1 million civilians in Rafah before the operation can take place, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked. Similar questions that perhaps people were asking in 2017 when this was happening in Mosul. Where are you going to evacuate 1 million Palestinians from Rafah when the majority of Gaza has already been destroyed by this incredibly asymmetrical, incredibly devastating bombardment campaign over the past months? The other question is, why would the United States be advising Israel this if there is actually capacity for targeted? They do have the weaponry to do targeted type attacks. We've seen them do assassinations. We've seen them, in fact, do assassinations in Gaza in the past months. They assassinated people, individuals that they wanted to take out, people whose voices were threatened. They were able to do precise targets. So it's not a question of whether or not they can or they can't. They can, but they're choosing instead a military strategy of mass destruction. And under any scenario, entering into Rafah would be mass destruction. We already know that. It begs me to ask the question because the situation in Mosul is not exactly parallel to the situation in Gaza. One, the United States and its coalition was fighting ISIS, which is not parallel to the Palestinian resistance. It's a consequence of the U.S. failed invasions and operations and occupations in the region in the past decades, of course. And it's, I think, a symbol of the U.S. failure and the U.S. failure to achieve its own objectives in the region, because all they were able to do was create more issues, more problems for themselves, more violence in the region, more chaos. They did nothing to bring so-called democracy, peace, stability, or anything of the sort. So we can't make a direct comparison between the two situations, but what is similar is that in both cases, the U.S. is facing conditions of defeat. In 2017, in Mosul, the United States again has been dragged into a regional conflict of its own creation that it's unable to escape, and it decides that the solution is mass destruction. Israel right now unable to achieve its military objectives, only able to kill in mass numbers, and honestly, the military objective of crushing the Palestinian resistance, of crushing Hamas, is unachievable under the current circumstances because it's not just Hamas who's resisting. It's impossible to separate the Palestinian resistance from the Palestinian people. If you are going to say your objective is to crush the Palestinian resistance, that means you're going to crush the Palestinian people. We have an entire population that is committed to their own liberation struggle. And so for Israel to want to go into Rafah and cause these similar scenes of mass destruction, which we've already seen in the rest of Gaza, I think is only a demonstration of the fact that they have no other options left on the table. They are facing conditions of defeat. They are facing the fact that they are unable, even to their own people, to skew this as any form of victory. And so the only thing they can try to do is wipe it off everyone's memory. Biden is in a very difficult position because his own population is holding him to account. I think the student movement is a sign of this. The student movement coming now after months of mass mobilizations is a sign of just how far consciousness has grown in the U.S. population. Biden is totally backed into a corner without a good option because he's not giving himself the option of actually ending the genocide and actually ending the kind of close collaboration, military, economic, political collaboration that he has with the Israeli state. That's the only option that he's not allowing himself to consider. That's the only option that perhaps would provide an exit from this losing strategy. In this case, Israel's defeat is a U.S. defeat. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that they would be proposing methodologies that also came up in a context of U.S. defeat or a U.S. inability to claim a victory in another military conflict.
Yeah, I think those are really, really important points. And I think it's important for people to learn how to watch TV or read the newspapers or dissect the news, because if you've heard the news, the media in the U.S., the corporate-owned, capitalist-owned media, the main message for the past maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks, was that Biden is mainly troubled about civilian casualties. He's really worried about civilian casualties. He's really angry with Netanyahu because so many civilians have been killed. He said too many have been killed, as if maybe if they had killed half of the 34,000, maybe that would have been enough, and not too many. You know, this kind of messaging that Biden is really concerned, it's not true. It's not true at all. They want to win the war. They feel at this point that they want to win, because then if they, quote, win, if they can defeat Hamas, then Biden can say, well, there was a lot of suffering, but it was worth it because we won. You know, like George W. Bush getting on the aircraft carrier 3 weeks after the U.S. toppled the Iraqi government in 2003, and he got on the aircraft carrier. They pulled the aircraft carrier into the port of San Diego just for the photo op, and he gets on the aircraft carrier with his bombardier jacket. He's looking tough and all military, even though, you know, he's basically avoided the war in Vietnam when he was a young person. And he said, "Mission accomplished." And there was a big banner he stood under, "Mission accomplished." Well, of course, that turned out to be a fantasy because, as you said, Layan, within a couple of years, and only after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, ISIS was formed. All kinds of resistance forces came about. The U.S. was basically driven from Iraq. It was driven from Afghanistan. Taliban is the government now. Like in each and every instance, just killing people and acting with this amazing arrogance and hubris and brutality and using limitless violence, it doesn't make the United States any stronger in the region. In fact, when Obama said we want to pivot to Asia, it was kind of like a message. Let's pivot towards Asia to compete with China instead of being bogged down in losing wars in the Middle East. But here we are again, and the U.S. is, quote, bogged down. Again, the Palestinians are doing all the dying. I'm looking at the New York Times headline from yesterday. Israel will expand civilian safe zone if it invades crowded Gazan city, officials say. Well, I don't know who writes these headlines, but doesn't it tear the mask off of what and who Biden really is and what the U.S. really is? Anyway, Layan, I want to play another clip before I get back to you. You remember that Biden said when he was pretending to care about Palestinians, he said on the March 7th State of the Union address, he said, we're going to build a pier, a temporary pier, and we're going to bring in humanitarian supplies, and we're going to save the poor people in Palestine. So they're shipping 2,000-pound bombs to Israel to drop on people in Gaza, but they were going to build this dock. And he said, no matter what the Israelis think, we're going to go ahead with it. We're going to save the lives of the people we just bombed. Here's from like 20 hours ago. Here's a U.S. military spokesperson, a major general, talking about the state of that dock, the one that, you know, was going to rescue and help all those poor Palestinians in Gaza. Just listen to this.
Thanks, Pat. Just a clarifying question on the pier. So are all of the necessary vessels to construct the pier and causeway already in theater, or are we still waiting for some of them to transit the Atlantic and get there before they can start construction? And if they're all there, are they just all on standby at this point, just waiting to begin construction?
As I understand it, all the necessary vessels are within the Mediterranean region and standing by, as I mentioned, to begin construction when given the order to do that.
They have not been given the order, Layan, to start building the dock. I mean, this was Biden's pretend I care about Palestinian speech at the State of the Union. That was March 7th. Go ahead.
I mean, he's just pretending. Absolutely. I hope everyone remembers some months ago when he was insisting that he couldn't verify whether the casualties were in fact as high as the Ministry of Health in Gaza was reporting. He has repeatedly denied reality. He went on television, on national television, after the first major Israeli bombing of a Palestinian hospital, and went on national television and said Israel did not bomb that hospital, even though the United States was the ones who had given the green light. So, I mean, this whole fake concern for civilian life, it's a ploy. I mean, he's not only losing in his military operations now and his imperialist war schemes, but he's also losing on the home front in his electoral campaign. And so he needs to kind of create a new image for himself. He's trying to distance himself from Netanyahu, from the more openly genocidal type of language that Netanyahu and some of his allies in the Israeli government use, distancing himself from that, saying that he wants a ceasefire, but doing nothing at all to actually implement it. There's no reason why he couldn't build that port, which anyway we all knew was more for show than for anything else. But there's absolutely no reason why he couldn't build that port. Like you said, like the military spokesperson said, it's just waiting on the order. I mean, it's all a theatrical move. All of these airdropped hot meals are really doing nothing to actually solve the or advance some sort of shift in this policy of famine that Israel has placed upon the Palestinian people. In fact, people are dying from the airdropped hot meals that hit people and as they're going to collect them, and they've killed many people, including children. So it's really a hypocritical position. It's just pure theatrics, and I think again is just an attempt to try to get himself out of the bind that he's in, where he's not only isolated on the world stage for his full backing of the genocide, but he's isolated on the home front. There's really no easy way out. He can't even go anywhere to give a speech without being called to account for his crimes. So it makes sense that he's going to try to convince people or hope people forget about what he's done in the past couple of months. But the mass movement has changed the terms on which the American public understands what's true and what's not. And this is not going to be very easy for him to do.
I want to bring up a headline. It's relevant because it's happening today. We're recording Wednesday afternoon, Layan. The Congress just passed a bill that allocates $95 billion for death and destruction. $60 billion go to Ukraine. I think it's $26 billion go to Israel, and then $8 billion to send advanced offensive weapons to Taiwan. Now, let's just dissect the headline here. I don't know, who are the New York Times headline writers? Who are these human beings? A good day for world peace, Biden, as Biden signs aid bill for Ukraine and Israel. In what way is that a good day for world peace? Biden said it. Yes, Biden is saying this is a good. He said a couple of things. He said it makes America feel safe, it makes the world feel safe, and it shows the world that America is still a leader. And I was like, okay. So when you send more money for death and destruction to Ukraine, to Israel, and to Taiwan, that's what American leadership looks like. It's not diplomacy. It's not soft power. It's not the promotion of democratic values and all of the stuff that the U.S. sort of says about itself. This is a good day for world peace, Layan. I don't know. Who writes the headlines? Like, how do you come up with this headline and not feel embarrassed?
I have no idea. And it seems to me that whoever is writing these headlines, and it's not just one person, it's very well coordinated, clearly, that the only thing that they could possibly think is that the American public is completely lacks intelligence. Because to write a headline like this after 6 months of constant debate and uncovering of, in fact, what those U.S. weapons have been doing in Palestine, to write a headline like this and think people are going to receive it well is kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's also really interesting because I think what's happened over the past couple of months, we've built understanding that U.S. military aid doesn't keep anybody safe. In fact, how many of the Israeli hostages were released by military means? The vast majority of them were released through negotiations, not through any sort of military operation. When Iran responded to that illegal assassination and bombardment of their embassy in Syria carried out by Israel, and Iran sent just a couple $1 million worth of kind of leftover drones and missiles, it was all things that are kind of outdated. And the US and the UK and France and Israel had to put their most advanced technology behind the Iron Dome and behind the Israeli defense system, spending over $1 billion. And we're still unable to deter the Iranian drone and missile landings from their military targets. I mean, it just goes to show that, first of all, this very advanced military aid is not able to completely deter the resistance across the world, and in particular in the Arab region, that is at a much greater disadvantage going up against the wealthiest country in the world and the biggest military in the world. And then secondly, people are now going to start questioning the role that the United States has been playing in Ukraine, for example. When the war in Ukraine first started, it was incredible to see how quickly even anti-war and progressive sectors of the U.S. public really rallied behind the calls to go against Russia, to sanction Russia, to defend Ukraine, because the United States has created a lot of confusion around, has been able to use a lot of propaganda, a lot of media manipulation to create a lot of confusion around the conditions that led to this conflict in the first place. And now, over the past 6 months, there's a lot more clarity about the role the U.S. plays in the geopolitical arena and the ways in which U.S. foreign policy actually create conditions of war, create conditions of violence, protect perhaps the narrow interests of very small number of global capitalists, that protect the narrow interests, in particular in the Arab region, of oil companies. There's U.S. military forces still deployed in Syria to this day, just defending oil resources that they have captured. And it's going to put into question the U.S. agenda in Ukraine. It's going to put into question the U.S. agenda in Taiwan against China. It's going to create fissures in the consensus that the United States was able to build among the general public around demonizing China, around demonizing Russia, and creating a justification for the warmongering that it has been carrying out over the past years against these two countries, trying to maintain its global hegemony. So what's cracking at the seams when we talk about the U.S. role in Palestine and its unconditional support for Israel is going to lead to cracking at the seams when it comes to talking about other military conflicts. I think this is a really important moment. It's a really dangerous moment for the White House and a really exciting opportunity for the anti-war movement, because there's a lot more opportunities to help bring more people into consciousness around exactly what it is that the U.S. agenda is for the world community. Is it really an agenda of peace, like the New York Times article says? Absolutely not. Everyone understands that giving more military aid to Israel is going to bring out more death, destruction, and genocide. So why would it be any different in Ukraine or in Taiwan?
I'm happy you framed it that way, and I think it's very important because around the country, people want to punish Biden, people who care about Palestine, people who oppose genocide. They want to punish Biden by abandoning Biden, which makes sense to me. Like, why would you vote for somebody who's promoting genocide, planning now for the invasion and destruction of Rafah? Why would you do that? You shouldn't. But the options are limited within ruling class politics in the United States because the Republicans are basically the same as the Democrats when it comes to all of the issues that you just identified. So if you have a situation where there are 535 members of Congress, and they're all basically have the same position on, more or less, all of them, on foreign policy issues, then you have to think, well, it can't be just that all of these individuals happen to sort of think the same thoughts, that in fact they are representatives of a system. And the system has a name. It's the capitalist system. Modern capitalism is the imperialist system. And of course, our show is the socialist program, and we're saying the problem really is capitalism and the alternative is socialism. But the question is, how do all the people who hate the wars, hate the genocide, who want to punish Biden, who want to get rid of all of the elements of a military-industrial complex, who want social justice at home, how do you get to the point where you realize that the problem really is the system? And that's a complicated, dynamic process. One, as you pointed out earlier, when people engage in struggle, they start to learn. Like being determines consciousness. If you're in the struggle, you're going to start to sort of figure out why when I'm protesting war, why are the police coming and beating me up? Why are the police arresting us? Why is the media treating us as the enemy? Why is this all happening? You sort of have to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And then the other thing that happens is that people on the left have to sharpen their sort of agitational arguments to expose the propaganda of the capitalist system, which always tries to make it seem like Afghanistan is different from Gaza. Gaza is different from Ukraine. Ukraine is different from Taiwan. In each instance, it's an issue where the U.S. is on the side of social justice, the ethical side, the moral side, and people don't see the connections. So what you're saying is so important because it's framing. How do we see the connections? There's another element of this, Layan, I'll just finish with this and then turn it back to you, which is there are some important talking points. When we look at that headline from the New York Times that says this is a good day for world peace, because the Biden administration is allocating $95 billion for war in Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. There's a couple of things about that. One, 80% of that money never leaves the United States. It goes directly to war contractors, who are the capitalists. So they're taking American tax dollars and giving it, instead of for schools or free healthcare or affordable healthcare or affordable housing or to deal with homelessness, giving it to the defense contractors, but saying, look, it's all for your own good. It's for national security. And then there's another sort of fact that you can bring out. Right now, the Francis Scott Key Bridge is still laying in ruins, the connecting bridge from the Baltimore port to Washington, D.C. It was hit by a cargo ship and brought down. I just looked this up the other day. The United States new budget allocates exactly $12.5 billion over the next 5 years, meaning about $2 billion a year, to repair the bridges in the United States. There are 617,000 bridges in the United States. 42% of them are more than 50 years old. Those are the bridges that are vulnerable to the kind of accident that happened outside the port of Baltimore. But you're going to spend $90 billion or $95 billion for death and destruction, and the U.S. government says, oh, but we can only spend $2 billion a year to restore and repair bridges. So these are the kind of talking points that we have to bring to the working class and the population in general in the United States. But even all of it has to be brought together with an analysis. And you're the education director at the People's Forum. You've done a lot of this work, bringing these kind of conjunctural points, what seems to be disparate issues together, and to see that the problem really is the system. And as a consequence, when we're organizing, we want to protest the genocide, but we also want to fight for something positive, which is to get a better system, a new system.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think one of the ways that people come to this consciousness is starting to feel very committed to the demand of ending the genocide and start asking the question, well, how are we going to do that? And it's not so simple as just signing a new policy, because then once you start to look into it, you start to see that the U.S. agenda, the U.S. behavior, the U.S. overall foreign and domestic policy is completely geared towards creating more war, more conflict that will benefit its resources, that will fill its capitalist coffers. And then you start to come to the conclusion that, in fact, it will need a change of system. It will need a complete overthrow of the current global capitalist system in order to end these imperialist wars. Obviously, that's not something that can be achieved in the short term. And so when people are engaged in the heat of struggle and that are fighting for the end to this genocide, coming to that conclusion can be very empowering if it's done in a collective manner, because then you can start to see how different waves of struggle, the mass movement, political pressure, many different dynamics and many different forms of struggle, and building consciousness that can lead to the transformation of the working class, that can lead to transformation of the masses, their consciousness, that can then create the conditions for moving towards a different system. That is something that's very exciting for people. It's concrete, it's real, it's happened in other places before, it can happen here too. And so once people come to the conclusion that, in fact, what is necessary in the long term is a system that is built around around different interests, not the same interests now that are the interests that drove the United States to work with the Israeli state to carry out this genocide of the Palestinian people, because it serves their interests. We need a new system organized around different interests, and that's going to be built by the people that carry those interests, the masses, the working class, the people who are right now out in the streets outraged by the genocide that's playing out. And the same people that were out not so long ago outraged by the white supremacist U.S. police system that is funded much more and equipped much more than many national militaries across the world, going out in the streets against police brutality and white supremacy, similar to now, also put people up against state repression and state violence, and brings people to the conclusion that it's not just about reforming one institution or another, it's actually the entire system that is culpable in creating this reality. And so we've seen multiple phases of this, even the pandemic, for example, when COVID-19 hit. And so many people were stranded, were actually unable to keep themselves safe, and many family members have died, unable to work, unable to make ends meet, while also trying not to get sick from the pandemic, and seeing the way in which the United States system completely was not organized to respond in the needs of its own population. All of these things are accumulation of political experience that lead to people coming to a greater and greater consciousness about what exactly it is that they're fighting. And a lot of times, when people are activated around one issue or another, people look for connections. And it's easy, for example, to say, Palestine is just the same as, I'm pro-Palestine, and it's just the same as Iraq, and it's just the same as Afghanistan, and it's just the same as Ferguson, and it's just the same as all these other places where oppression exists. And that can have a limiting framework, because it's not actually the same. The realities, the conditions on the ground are different. But what is the same is that they are all suffering from the consequences of the U.S. imperialist or U.S. capitalist interests being enforced. And in all those cases, it leads to oppression, it leads to violence, it leads to massacre, it leads to death and exploitation. That's the thing that's in common. And once we focus on those things, that being the common framework, that it's in fact U.S. imperialism that is carrying out the oppression, U.S. capitalism that is carrying out the exploitation, it can actually be very liberating, because no longer do we need to see ourselves as the same as every other context, but we can see ourselves all fighting the same enemy. and then we can share strategy. We can see how different movements, different struggles relate to each other, how they can support each other, how they can build off of each other. And in fact, that what we're fighting for is concrete. It is realizable. It may take a long time, but it is actually very possible. It is not just something that we imagine or desire or think about or paint pictures about. It is something that we are actually fighting for and committed to making happen.
You know, if you think about socialist theory, which is part of what we're getting at here, socialist theory or Marxist theory is the generalizing of the experiences in what Marx would have called the class struggle. And the class struggle isn't simply about workers fighting capitalist bosses on the job for better wages or better working conditions, although that's definitely part of it. It's all of these other elements that you're talking about. So war is a byproduct of a system and is a byproduct of the capitalist system. So if you're really fighting against the roots of war, the origin of war, or why there's endless war, you have to kind of get to the issue of the system, and then you get back to capitalism. So when you talk about the class struggle, it's about war, it's about racism, it's about the exploitation of workers on the job, it's about the oppression of women, the oppression of the LGBTQ community, you name it. The absence of people having the right to go to a doctor when they're sick. Half of the bankruptcies in the United States, personal bankruptcies, are from people not able to pay their doctor's bills. Like, all of these specific and different real things are still connected back to a system. And so the theorizing of this experience leads one to the idea like, okay, these problems are not because of mistakes. They're not because of this politician's bad and the other politicians are better. It's really rooted in the system. So it's a systemic analysis. And then there is this other part of theorizing from experience. And I think I want to highlight this because I think it's very pertinent for the moment. If you think, you mentioned Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter movement, the what happened in 2020, COVID, like all of these different phases of the recent struggle. In the Occupy movement in 2011, people said, we are the 99%. It was kind of a generalized, somewhat vague, sort of holding the system, the capitalist system, to the account that says we are the 99%, the 1%, the capitalists are the problem, and like all of the problems. And those encampments were kind of small in the beginning, but then on October 1st, 2011, the police in New York City arrested 700 people on the Brooklyn Bridge, and immediately people all over the country who were kind of just sort of paying attention got outraged about police repression. And so the repression, because the Occupy movement wasn't going to fade, it actually made the movement grow. In 2014, the community in Ferguson, when Mike Brown was killed, they rose up. I mean, that's not unusual that there are, responses from Black communities or Latino communities about the epidemic of police violence and police murder. The communities rise up. But in the case of Ferguson, it didn't end after a few days. It continued. It was protracted. It went on for weeks. And that then brought all of this police violence down on the heads of the people in Ferguson, but it sparked the movement for Black lives. Then you have 2020 and what happened there when the repression that Trump tried to direct against the street protests after the killing of George Floyd, that became a national mass movement. And now here we are again, and I want to just get to this main point. This is what the students were facing in the last week, and they're still facing, this repression. As long as those students remain steadfast, and as long as their allies come and help them, instead of the repression doing the trick, and meaning getting people to be scared, worried about getting suspended or expelled or losing their place to live, it actually made the movement grow. And so we're in this kind of epic battle and theorizing about how movements grow. If we respond to repression by fighting back, if we are in fact inspired by the Palestinians who, in spite of repression of the worst type, far greater than anything people in the U.S. have experienced, at least in modern times, this steadfastness, this resilience, this unwillingness to stop fighting, it actually becomes the key element. It's the number one key element in forging a viable movement that can actually win. Anyway, go ahead.
I think you've said it perfectly, Brian. And I think that what happened in the past week is a perfect example with the student movement. I mean, Columbia's encampment has lasted now a week. And every day of that week, multiple universities across the country have also launched encampments. Some of them have faced also mass arrests, police repression, expulsions, threats from the administration or different state actors or from Zionists. And instead, they have maintained themselves. They have remained steadfast. They have continued holding their encampments, rebuilt them in the cases in which they were swept or repressed, and created an atmosphere that encourages more students to also do the same in their campuses. And I think this is a perfect example, an absolutely perfect example of a moment when not only people's political consciousness is changing around the issues that they're fighting about. It's not just that people are realizing that to stand with the Palestinian people is to stand with justice. What they're also realizing is that they have the capacity, when they are together and they are organized and they stand together, they have the capacity to stand up to and defeat the forces that are at this moment responsible for the fight, the war on the Palestinian people, the genocide of the Palestinian people, and are also responsible for unleashing the forces of state repression on these students. They have reached a point where they have realized that they actually have the option to win in their battle against the administration, against the NYPD, or any other instrument of state power that is trying to quash the strength of the movement right now. And the thing that makes that possible is being organized, is standing confidently with each other, and is maintaining a unified strength throughout any conditions. I mean, what's happened at Columbia and what's happened in the student movement over the past couple of months, it's not just this week. The students have been facing all sorts of repressive tactics. Multiple student organizers have been suspended. Entire SJP chapters have been suspended. The National Students for Justice in Palestine organization has been making it very clear that multiple chapters have been facing very severe harassment and attack from very well-funded Zionist institutions who spend billions of dollars, honestly, to try to counter a pro-Palestinian narrative on university campuses. They've been facing this for months. Even some students were shot months ago in November for wearing a keffiyeh near their campus. Some students at Columbia were attacked with chemical weapons on campus. So it's not new that they've been facing this repression, but this moment, what makes it different is that the students almost in unison across the country are taking a collective stand. And it's putting the administrations on notice. They do mass arrests, and then thousands of people are going to be outside the university gates. The students are going to rebuild their encampment, and the international media is going to be making it the headline of the day. It's embarrassing for the university. It is an untenable situation for the university, and it's created by the organized strength of the student movement. And I think that's a key political lesson for people in struggle right now, and it's something that is going to build the basis for building the strength of the movement even further from this moment. It's showing that we should not expect any steps backward. As much as Biden would love for this to die down, it's really not looking likely that that's going to happen. In fact, the more they attack the movement, the more people learn and gain the skills to be able to counter it. Number one skill being organized strength and unity.
We're just moving towards the end here, Layan, but I do want to mention that there's this false argument being directed against the students that they are creating an unsafe environment for Jewish students. And the irony, the ridiculousness of this thing is not only is it not true, but a great number of the students are also Jewish. And even at Columbia, or as Columbia was being threatened with the National Guard last night, Jewish Americans having mass demonstrations and being mass arrested at the beginning of Passover. So the government, the right wing, is making this completely ridiculous allegation that the protests on the campus have become really threatening to Jewish students. And that's why at Columbia, for instance, they said they're going to take all the college study online, because otherwise Jewish students wouldn't be safe. The movement that exists in the United States is largely led by young Palestinians, which makes sense. It's their families who are in Palestine. And these young Palestinians, the folks in the Palestinian youth movement and the SJPs and elsewhere, they have amazing political clarity. They're connected to their people. They're connected to the homeland. They know a lot. But it's not just Palestinians. This is a broad movement. This is Black students, it's Latino students, it's Asian American students, it's Arab American students, and it's a lot of young Jewish people. And we see here in the beginning, this movement has created, in a way, in real life, and contrary to the false narrative of those who say that this is anti-Semitic, the beginning of a genuine multinational, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, unified movement. There will be differences of opinion about politics. Is it the system? What are the right tactics? There's always political debates. That's normal. But there is this kind of underlying unity. And I think it's something that really is being nurtured. And it's a recognition, too, that the Palestinian young people are in many ways the leaders. I mean, you're a young Palestinian organizer building bridges with all of these different people, different communities. There's a conference coming up in Detroit that sort of is trying to, in addition to all the street activism, bring people together to sort of summarize some of the big lessons about Gaza, about the U.S. relationship with Israel, but also about our movement and how this new, very different, distinct, unique movement has become so successful in spite of all of the odds and repression, et cetera. Just talk a little bit about the conference, what its significance is, and if somebody's watching this show and wants to come to the conference, be involved with it, how do they do that?
Absolutely. Well, the conference is, I think, extremely important moment for us to convene as a movement, and like you said, broad, multinational, multi-ethnic movement, because what has happened, not just in the United States, but the way in which the Palestinian struggle has lit the fire of mass struggle against Zionism and imperialism across the globe, is a sign that the fight for Palestinian liberation, the fight right now that's happening on the ground in Gaza, is centralizing, is at the forefront of the struggle against imperialism in a very important way. The masses across the world are not just rising up for Palestine because everybody is hearing about and learning about Palestine and loves the Palestinian people and is feeling empathy or sympathy with it. They're identifying the fact that the struggle against imperialism and against Zionism is in fact going to set the conditions for the struggle against imperialism going forward. And similarly, in the United States, we see that the fight against the U.S.-backed genocide in Palestine that's playing out in the United States, like we've been talking about for the past hour, has exposed the way in which the U.S. system is complicit in all of the forms of oppression that people from different nationalities, from different backgrounds experience inside and outside the United States borders. And so this conference is a really important moment to convene, to consolidate, to synthesize a lot of the lessons that we have rapidly accumulated over the past couple of months in the streets, in the planning rooms, in the volunteer meetings, when thinking about strategy and tactics, thinking about the ways in which we analyze the current moment, the ways that we've been able to sharpen our ability to see through the White House's agendas, the White House's moves. We're able to think about the different ways in which we need to build the movement, that we need to mobilize the movement in order to keep putting pressure on the White House and keep pushing the mass movement to be a factor in the way the White House is considering what its options are. We need this space to be able to reflect, not only reflect, but also to meet each other, to see exactly who is in the streets together right now and prepare for the next phase. Because I think also what is very clear is that what this mass movement has achieved is a new consensus around the need to struggle against the system overall. And I expect that in whatever form or shape it takes in the next months and years, the fight for Palestine is not dying down; it's getting stronger. But then, what comes next? And this conference is a very important moment for us to be able to convene and prepare for that long-term phase of struggle that is coming next, which is still unclear. The shape of it is not clear yet, but it will only become clear when we figure that out together. And so having a moment in which we can actually share analysis, exchange, debate, and discuss is going to be very essential for strengthening the movement going forward. We know that the ruling class is very well coordinated. We can see the ways in which you look at the headlines in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and all the other capitalist media, corporate media outlets, and the ways in which they coordinate on talking points. We see the ways in which different US, academic institutions are coordinating on repressive tactics and the like. And so we've also learned in the past 6 months that when we're organized, that is the way that we're able to combat repression, and not only combat repression, but take steps forward in the struggle. And so this conference is one of the many important convening spaces that we will need in order to keep building that organization, in order to be more effective and combat what is certainly going to be more attempts at repression coming forward.
All right, that's going to be the People's Conference for Palestine. People can register by going to peoplesconferenceforpalestine.org, and it's up there on the screen. People can check it out. Registration is open. It's going to be in Detroit, Michigan, on the weekend of May 24th, 25th, 26th. So take advantage of this moment to come together with others who are building this fight for liberation and justice. Layan, thank you so much for joining the Socialist Program.
Thank you again for having me. And we'll see you in Detroit.